Hello, welcome to another beautiful day here at Looking Through the Glass. We have Giselle and we have Robert Mahoney. Robert, you are an expert or a very educated person in in a field that a lot of people really need a lot of help in, and that is dealing with uh, threats. Threats. There you go. Thank you, Giselle. My brain is totally just took left field right before this. I apologize about that. So I'm going to it off to you, Robert. Robert, it's what you do and what it entails.
Yeah, so I'm a violence prevention expert. That's where I sort of
It's so much
focus most of
easier for
my
me to say.
attention on. So it's sort of targeted violence and terrorism. So the idea being that an individual with targeted violence, sort of self-explanatory, you target a group of people or certain building or things like that, and you commit violence there. Terrorism is a little bit more broad, where you're committing the act of violence for a purpose, but you don't necessarily care who gets hurt. The idea is to instoke fear on a grand scale, and so all targeted violence is terrorism. Not all terrorism is targeted violence. So we'll start there. Most of what I focus in on is, as I mentioned, sort of in the prevention sort of field. And what I've done is kind of packaged security, holistic security, into three or four different sort of subsets. And one of those is prevention. The second is protection, and the third slash fourth is sort of preparedness slash response. And I focus more on the prevention side of things because I have come to find that there is a underweight of value in prevention, and that people generally shift to overvaluing protection and preparedness. And when I mean by protection and preparedness, I'm talking about obviously preparedness and response. You're talking about your active shooter drills and things of that nature. And then protection, we're talking about like your cameras, your bulletproof glass, your fences, your security personnel that are sort of outward facing, even so much as like SROs or school resource officers. Those are all, they do have a prevention aspect to them, where if they are employed, you're trying to prevent loss of life. But for my purposes, those are more protection or preparedness. They're not actually preventing the event from ever occurring. And so
Yeah.
by focusing in on more upstream, having a much more upstream mentality on how we tackle security in general, we can actually create more value for those protection and preparedness aspects, but really focusing in on the individual and how do we prevent these types of attacks from ever occurring in the first place.
That's
That was
actually
wonderful.
wow.
Yeah, that is well, it's very interesting because you are looking at it. I really do see where you're talking about as far as, having the people employed and in position is more of a not a prevention, but more of a afterward or than just having those kinds of things around a protection mode more than and stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
it makes sense, because I think what really hooked me into the prevention side of the field was I kept seeing this weird paradox of narratives after an attack, of sort of a random attack, a random act of violence, right?
yeah,
That would be talked about, but then having the institutions that were doing the investigation, or as more information would come out of the perpetrator of the attack, that they were like known entities, that police had shown up at their home numerous times or had communications with their family over concerning behavior. Mental health may or may not have been involved, in certain aspects, or
there's a
had like an
paper
off and
trail, in
on
other words.
history. the education, if that happened at a school, they would have said like, yeah, we've had, he's been suspended a bunch of times and things like that. And this sort of like weird counter narrative of like, well, it isn't a random act of violence at all, is it? That if you knew the person was a problem, then it's not really random. And so I think when we start using that framing of random act of violence, that narrative sort of lends itself for us in the general public to sort of, all right, well, if I'm just sort of in the worst bingo game imaginable, like my number is just going to get called and I don't have any control over that, then yeah, that would make sense that we would move more to that protection and preparedness response sort of mentality, right? And so the idea being that, one, when you look at it scientifically, there is no such thing as a random act of violence. All violence has a lead up to it, and we'll probably get into more of the minutia in this interview of how that works and what that looks like. But also sort of just the way in which we kind of have structured these systems that are designed to sort of protect us, and sort of the latent error that we have kind of created where, we're actually inviting more bad things to sort of happen to us, and then doubling down on the things that are actually prohibiting us from being more proactive, right? And we're
Yeah.
taking a far more defensive approach because we just frame it in a way that lends itself to being more defensive rather than proactive.
Oh yeah, because I think the one thing that I've always questioned is why did they go and harm, you know, a group of kids or targeted a school or targeted a church? Like the targets are never the same. It's always different. So I guess that definitely will help other people open the mind of going, okay, why are they targeting?
Well, that's a great point because focusing in on the why rather than the what is another thing that I see a stumbling block for a lot of these, especially schools and just the general public, is that there is we invoke sort of like our inherent biases when we focus in on what the individual is saying, or we create a profile based upon different biases and sort of different views that we have on certain things. And so you have a weird empathy shift where somebody that has obvious substance abuse issues, or somebody that has severe depression and suicidal ideation and things like that, there is a level of empathy that we have to go and sort of help those individuals. When you have people that are kind of ranting and raving about a specific, political group, or a group, a certain race or religion, or a mixture of all the things, we tend to sort of isolate and want to push those people sort of over into the corner, and we don't make the reference that these are sort of this bombastic behavior and this more radicalized behavior is actually a call for help. That you don't need to be sort of drunk, finding yourself at 6 a.m. falling asleep in the gutter to realize that like you need help. We just translate it very differently, and I think one of the reasons why we do that is because, one, we just have a general safety sense that we put, and we like that feels like something that's going to be a problem, and for my own safety I'm going to separate myself from it. And when we look at prevention and classic prevention, or the security prevention, you will see these individuals who have long histories of seemingly innocuous one-off events that go sort of untreated. And in the same way that somebody with suicidal ideation will sort of broadcast their intent to sort of see what they can get away with or to see who's going to come and try to help them, it's the same sort of way. But because these things are more taboo and we just don't have that empathy, the same empathy for those types of individuals that we do for the others, we seemingly keep pushing that threshold line farther and farther closer to the attack. And that obviously creates much more pressure on those protection and preparedness methodologies, because by the time that person crosses that threshold, you are really trying to thread a needle of getting to that individual before the attack happens. And that often, as we've seen, isn't always is great. In fact, there was one of the during some of my speaking engagements, one of the cases that I highlight is the case of this Dayton, Ohio shooting by this guy called Connor Betts. And Connor went to a very popular nightlife sort of street in Dayton, Ohio. And within like 100 feet between the point where he first fired a shot to the point where he was taken down by police, he was able to, I think, kill 9 people, 27 people injured, 47 shots fired, and it was only 32 seconds, right? And there were
Wow.
eight cops that were already there because it's a popular nightlife sort of avenue. And I use that as an example to sort of say, like, listen, 32 seconds between first shot and neutralization of the individual, you're going to be pretty hard pressed to get better than that, right? And then
Yeah, absolutely.
more and more information comes out about Connor Betts, who was, I believe he was in his early 20s when he did this, that had a history of behavioral problems from dating back to when he was in kindergarten, 4 and 5 years old, right? And had a number of incidences with the police over certain behaviors that he was doing, certain domestics, in and out of mental health sort of care, and then obviously we talked about sort of the education. So you had almost like a decade-long runway
Of red
with that
flags.
individual that you then try to cram into 30 seconds of trying to intercede, right? And so it just demonstrates the point that, by focusing much more on the prevention side, you get to these individuals way before they even contemplate doing something on a mass violence sort of scale.
So it's kind of like you're trying to prevent it by helping those individuals who have some sort of mental health, but it's not being nobody's paying attention enough to help them.
Yes, I think you look at it as sort of like a death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? And so
Sliding through the system is what keeps happening is the system keeps failing.
right, and I think that systems thing is a really cool thing to sort of zero in on, because I mentioned sort of like the latent error sort of thing that we've kind of created. And I think within systems, I think we can all sort of agree that when you develop a system, systems are definitely lend themselves to a more rigid approach towards things. And you might find networks, and I certainly have found networks that cross over different systems, but they're usually single points of failure. Like there's usually one person within one system who sees that they need to be more coordinated, and then that individual retires, or they move on to something, and then the whole network kind of collapses. And we've definitely hyper specialized these systems, and I've worked with states that could have analytics that could tell you, just for example, if you were a first-time recipient of food stamps, they could tell you from the month, week, and day that you would end up coming back for housing assistance, right? But there's no linkage between the systems because we've kind of defined their lane and we have optimized that system based upon the issue that they are tasked with sort of solving. And so the idea that you would only have food insecurity as one of your problems and that if you just solve that, all of your problems would go away is probably a little bit fantastical, right? You probably are dealing with a lot of different things or on the edge of dealing with a lot of different things. And to place the onus on the person in crisis in that moment to then try to figure out, oh, in 2 months, a week, and 3 days, I'm going to now be kicked out of my apartment is a bit much, right? When you're just trying to struggle to get food on the table. And so really what we have is more of a system of care rather than sort of a concept of care. And part of the prevention framework that I try to instill is, looking for those behavioral oddities, in looking for rises and falls in certain behaviors and addressing those as you sort of see them, rather than waiting for them to sort of be qualified to get public assistance or to get help, like, to cross sort of this theoretical threshold where now we can be proactive with you, even though, you have over the last couple of months could have used a lot of help before getting to this point. And now we're sort of in this downward loop of trying to play catch up of what we can try to help you with. And I'm located up here in New England, and I've worked with a state in Vermont which published a report on specifically on suicide within the state, and they looked at all the people that committed suicide within that state within 1 calendar year. And what they found was that 98% of those individuals were receiving some type or were in the database of public assistance, all right, for at least one public assistance or public health entity. They found their names within the system, and 78% of them they found were in 3 or more systems, right?
It's a significant sign.
And so I think there's a lot of different things we can pull out of that. One, let's give kudos to Vermont for even publishing that report. That sounds like something that like most states probably have.
Are not doing.
Certainly
Couldn't just call it straight out.
Yeah, certainly
they are just
know
not
or
doing
have
it.
that information, but are not going to share it. But also the idea that we don't, this again going back to sort of the random act of violence, that we don't know who these people are is a complete fallacy, right? The idea that, Connor Betts is able to have 10 plus years of reports about him, people concerned about him and everything else, and yet nothing ultra proactive was done in order to sort of off-ramp him. The idea that 78% of people within your state commit suicide and they're in 3 different systems within the state looking for assistance sort of shows the rigidity of the systems that we've kind of created. And my belief is more that we just have sort of, we've hardened these lanes so much and focused so much on sort of a defensive posture or a threshold criteria that we're not able to be proactive. And a lot of audiences that I talk to, they'll come up to me after and they'll be like, this is fantastic. This is exactly what we've been wanting and we'd love to do it. But these roots of just how we do things are really entrenched, and it really takes a lot of effort to kind of figure out where each one of these pieces are. And I've kind of coined it as being a little bit like analogous to taking out the Christmas lights at at Christmas time out of the box, and they're all tangled because you just threw them in after you took them down off the tree. And it's somebody's going to have to go and take the time and take the hours and pull them apart and try to figure out where it is. And sometimes it's just easier for governments and for legislatures and stuff like that to just rack and stack, like just throw some more money on it, broaden a couple of scopes of different things. Then you got mission creep. Then people are fighting for their own resources and territories and responsibilities and things like that, and you just kind of like pile on and pile on and pile on. One of the organizations that I work with nationally actually is the 988 call centers and that whole thing, which I love. I think it's definitely something that is worthwhile and has value. I think there's been a lot of trip ups in it because they kind of HHS kind of released 988 with this idea that the states were going to be able to sort of make it what they want to make it. And 988 has had a problem of being sort of a supplement, but not like the go-to thing, right? And police departments, very progressive police departments, have already put sort of ride-along programs with mental health professionals embedded in sort of the police force for those types of calls. You have CIT teams or crisis intervention teams that are around the state or in certain parts that also take on that same sort of responsibility. And then you kind of have 988, which is there, and it's very difficult to try and figure out, well, what's the tip of the spear? Like, who do I call first? Do I call 911 and hope that they have, a mental health professional on there, or do I call one of the CIT teams that have been well established over the years in the States, or do I call this new 988 system? And like, what are their capabilities? And is the capability that's in your state same as the capability that's in my state? And
which they will
are
not
we
be.
looking at tip of the spear, or are we looking at sort of like the safety net where we'll catch 988 will catch all the overflow, or do we want 988 to be the first responders and then everything else is catching overflow? And I think there's a lot to that, but again, somebody has to kind of like get in the weeds on that stuff and really kind of untangle it. And I just think that it's just not something that a lot of legislatures look at and been like, man, this is going to take forever. Like, I'll be out of office, or I just won't see, the intangibles that come out of it, and therefore, like, it doesn't seem like a risk reward benefit.
Absolutely. I can see where you're talking about that as far as the legislative goes, because if you're not dealing with it first-handedly, and it's so much easier to put band-aids on top of things or not even see it, and you just put band-aids because they're only seeing a little portion of all of this stuff instead of the whole broad spectrum.
Yeah.
So they're putting band-aids on these little spots, but it's not taking care of everything.
Yeah, like, and that goes to that kind of that what versus the why, right? And you had mentioned that, Giselle, about the, we will focus in if I have sort of like neo-Nazi rhetoric, or if I have, pick your poison, certain religious, rantings and ravings and stuff like that. We'll focus
things out there.
Yeah, we'll focus on the what, right? And we'll focus on trying to debate that and trying to off-ramp that what, rather than dive a little deeper into like the why. And what we have found within the prevention space is really, and sort of like the overall radicalization space, is it's not so much the message that is like getting clinged on to. It's more the intangibles. And what those intangibles really are is a sense of identity, a sense of community, and a sense of purpose. Excuse me. And everybody, irregardless of political affiliation, race, religion, anything else, we are all looking for things that will fill those buckets, right?
Yes.
And the human brain finds it incredibly unacceptable for us to not know who we are. And so in the absence of knowing who we are, we will go and try to find something that fills those buckets. And we have seen individuals who have carried out attacks who write sort of their final will and testament or their manifesto or what have you, that actually apologize for the hurt that they know that they're going to cause. And that, because unlike substance abuse, where you sort of have a physical addiction that you can't really break away from, radicalization, and especially once you sort of interweave the identity, the community, and the purpose into that, you have an emotional and psychological attachment to it. And so it lends itself to a different type of intervention. And in fact, I would encourage people to not call it intervention because of this, because intervention has a top-down power dynamic to it where you are sort of coming over the top and basically saying to this person, you can't, what you're doing to yourself is terrible. It's going to get others hurt as well. And we are determining that you can't do this by yourself. So we're taking the reins from you and we're going to sort of help you through this. Right?
Yes, we're going to take power over everything.
We're going to take the power over everything else. When you do that to somebody who like has a physical addiction, that kind of works, right? Because their mentality is that they probably want to get better, they just can't physically do it. When you have a psychological and emotional addiction like you do with the people that sort of I deal with, now some of them do have other substance abuse issues and things like that contribute to it.
Yeah.
But for the most part, if you have something that is sort of ideologically and purpose driven, you have an emotional and psychological addiction to that. And the idea that you would sever that cold turkey, right, is and go back into that sort of unknown is unacceptable. It's just not, it's not possible that you psychologically and emotionally cannot do it. And so I have trained individuals to look at it more as sort of like an intercession and more of like a hostage negotiation where you are presenting options to that individual and you are trying to showcase different options for identity, different options for community, different options for purpose, and that they are able to see those buckets being filled in another way, and therefore they are only as faithful as their options dictate. And so if there is a better option out there for them, they will take it, rather than sort of a intervention approach, which is more of like an obligation. We are obligating you to do this, right? And we do see this in sort of like Alcoholics Anonymous has this same sort of approach where they will give people that attend their meetings a new identity, right? I'm Rob Mahoney, I'm an alcoholic. Boom, there's my identity. Everybody that's in that, in that circle with me, they're now my community. They're all like-minded individuals. So now I have a community to sort of lean on. And then our shared purpose and my purpose is to never go back to my addiction. And my purpose is also to help everybody else in that community stay on the straight and narrow with theirs. And so they create the other option, right? There is another option here for you, and there's another purpose here for you. And that is when you understand how behavior works and how behavior does not focus itself necessarily on logic, but rather on feelings, then you kind of understand how we maneuver around the world, and how we explain the world, and being able to sort of highlight those things from a prevention standpoint is very, very important, because if you try to debate them with facts, or you try to go over the top and prohibit them from, speaking in a certain way, or reading certain books, or going on certain websites, or something like that, there is a natural tendency to, you're creating sort of like a personal attack upon them.
Mhm.
And so they will remove themselves further and further and further away from sort of society and those connections to society. And they will basically dig in their heels, and they will double down on those belief systems, or that conspiracy theory, or what have you, whatever's filling those buckets, because they have to, because that's where, like, they are the most accepted. That's where they find their purpose and who they are. And so we often find people who, there's a lot of schools who have begun to sort of transition, especially after Parkland, to not suspending an individual that does a threat against others in the school, or a threat to the school, but rather sort of wrap resources around that individual, rather than sort of suspend them or expel them, because that gives them more time to plan, but also compounds their feeling that they are sort of an outlier, right? And that nobody cares about them. And that, much like what we talked about, that empathy sort of divide that we have for the individuals, we're separating you away, go away from us, right?
Yeah, you're
And
now
so,
in exile, basically.
exactly. And so understanding how that sort of radicalization sort of takes form, that why, rather than the what, is more important than I think most people realize.
Absolutely agree with you on that one.
That is
You
definitely
had
a
something. Yeah, you had something to say a second ago, Giselle. I don't know if you still remember.
no, there was a lot of information that
I
went
know,
in.
yeah, that's it.
There is a lot of information. So,
It's
okay, so
amazing.
Well, it's also, I think, going back, I can deep dive a little bit more onto sort of like how framing and the behaviors sort of work, because I talked sort of at the top about this idea of like framing this problem as sort of a random act of violence, and then moving our behaviors into one direction. And there's a couple other examples that you can sort of see how we just change our behavior, or our feelings about something, based upon just how things are framed. And so if I say, 8%, if something happens, 8% of the world's population is going to die, you immediately feel that is a catastrophic event, right? If I say an event is going to happen and 92% of the world's population will live, it creates a completely different context and a behavioral change in what we're going to do. They both say the same thing,
same
but
exact thing, but it's
it
The way it's
changes
worded.
it changes the framing of what our feelings are and what our behaviors are. And part of one of the things that I do to try and showcase why there is value to the protection and the preparedness, but it might be overvalued, is to reframe it in the same way of almost how understanding how we approach value within itself and the narrative that we have. I have an experience where I went into a liquor store one time in a city, and as I approached, I saw cameras outside, and I saw cages on the windows, and I saw big bright lights right in front of a reinforced door. And I open that door, and I go into sort of like this little holding area where I then have to go through a metal detector. Then I'm getting wounded by a security guard who's also armed. And then I finally am able to walk into the establishment, the liquor store, and I'm seeing TVs that are broadcasting sort of both internal CCTV and external CCTV, the floor to ceiling bulletproof glass, and then I'm got to do all of my commerce through a drawer. And logically, from a protection standpoint, this is the most secure place I've ever been in my entire life. I've also never been more scared to be in this place, right?
I was thinking that the entire time.
Because the narrative goes to not, oh, look at all these protection measures, this is a safe place.
What the
It's
hell
what the
happened
hell
here?
goes
Why
on here,
all of
right?
this here?
What the hell goes on here that they decided
That
that
they need all this.
this was an appropriate amount of things to have. And I think from a security standpoint, that really changes the whole environment, right? And
Mhm.
schools don't necessarily, when I go and talk to schools, they almost feel compelled to buy the cameras, to have the extra security, to have the metal detectors, to have the roaming SROs and everything else. And it's not that there isn't value to that, but you have to understand that the more you put that into the environment, you are going to create different behaviors
You're
because of it.
changing the energy of the environment
Yeah,
completely.
completely.
And
And
we're talking about where these individuals go off of feelings and the energy of the environment that they're in, they're going to feel.
absolutely. And also, as a sort of a security professional, one of the things, just from an evolutionary anthropologic sort of way of how we operate in the world, we look for abnormalities. Okay. We don't
Hmm.
have enough bandwidth to take everything on. So our senses of smell, hearing, sight, taste, et cetera, provide us with information of an abnormality. And when you are a security professional, you want to pinpoint your attention to those abnormalities. And not to get too zen, but it was described to me once, and I've taken it and I've gotten miles and miles and miles off of it. But what you want to do is you want to make that water as still as possible so that you can see what's causing the ripple. Okay?
Mm.
And when you add all of these things to the environment, you are adding noise and causing more ripples. And therefore you are missing the slight abnormalities, and you're sort of lumping everybody into one thing. And that lends itself to creating sort of this threshold mentality where what is the difference between a kid in a school that sits in the corner and doesn't really cause a lot of problems or is quiet to a kid that's in the corner, doesn't cause a lot of problems, is quiet, but is in the grips of isolation, right? And is having issues being compounded privately that you don't recognize because they're not screaming at your face, right? And we have instituted a bunch of, you'll hear sort of like behavioral threat assessment, which is something that has become very, very popular in security realms. And at the core of behavioral threat assessment is trying to dispel those sort of natural biases. It's really to look away from so much of the what, but the why. So are there abnormalities within the behaviors that are triggering concern or are just different that we should go and examine? And while that has been proven to be absolutely fantastic and has worked extremely well, I hate the name of it. and and I'm a big promoter. I'm a certified behavioral threat assessment, practitioner, and I can instill these things, and I know how to teach it and all this other stuff. But what it does is, in the same way that we've just been talking about framing, when I say behavioral threat assessment, your mind goes to, I need to look out for threatening behavior,
Hmm.
Yes.
right? And
Maybe
again,
your mind picks up keywords.
yep. And we're once again sort of back into the protection and response, right? And so
Yeah.
one of the best things that we have done for schools that are interested in establishing a behavioral threat assessment, and I will say to your audience, there has never been a school that has instituted a behavioral threat assessment methodology that has taken it out. right? That, oh, we tried this, we didn't like it, we're going to go do something else. Once it's in, it's ingrained, and everybody loves it. But we changed the name away from threat assessment to a care team.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Big
reason we
difference.
did that was because threat, as you mentioned, we hit a keyword. I'm looking for threatening behavior. And what I mentioned, if we look at Connor Betts, or we look at all these other, Robert Card, or the multitude of different individuals who have done these attacks, and that their process through that sort of pathway of violence, it was made up of a bunch of things that were not threatening in any sort of way, right? Divorce, or the death of a grandfather, or quitting the soccer team, or not being picked for a soccer team, or something like that. These are not threatening events, and
Or a
therefore
breakup.
they are not deemed. You wouldn't bring those necessarily to an SRO or a behavioral threat assessment, or even a counselor that's there that's dealing with sort of individuals. But a care team encompasses sort of, it's broad, right? We're all just sort of looking for things that we're concerned about to give people help. And you can make that as small. You can have it just in a class. You can have it in a school. You can have it district wide. And the greatest example of what we did when we changed that name was the school district, their bus drivers got brought into the care team. And it was specifically designed to they thought it was going to bring threatening behavior information in. And what they ended up finding was that they ended up intervening for a kid who was getting picked up and dropped off at a different stop, and found out that there was some domestic abuse that was happening on at the home, right? They intervened on a kid's behalf because they were coming to the bus stop and the car looked like it was filled with mattresses and pillows, and sure enough, they had been kicked out of their apartment, right? These aren't things that necessarily relate themselves to sort of a mass shooting, but left untreated, these are the things that sort of pile up.
Meet up
And
too.
Yes, it
and
manifests.
right, and those grievances that we have, and when you look at the pathway of violence, it usually starts with a grievance and moves to an ideation. And so, since we all have grievances, that's not a really a telltale sign. But if those grievances are not sort of handled in an appropriate way, or that sort of tension isn't able to be released in an effective way, you can see how that turns into an ideation, right? And
Absolutely.
instead of trying, I've had a bunch of teachers come up to me, usually at the end of August, when they're, preparing for the school year, and they're getting all of their trainings, and they're getting a training on signs of substance abuse, and signs of child abuse, and signs of trafficking and sexual abuse. And then I come in with my sort of like my violence prevention stuff. And they'll be like, oh, we heard you talk and we thought it was this, but it could have also been that. And I didn't really know. And so I decided, I'll wait to see if more risk factors or more behaviors present themselves. And then we'll figure out the appropriate, course of treatment through there. And, that's the opposite of what we sort of want. Right? And because the next time a behavior or an incident happens or a risk factor presents itself, that individual might not be in the class anymore, or it may be, in a different setting. So we don't know about it and everything else. So we really want to broaden that framing scope. And we've had a lot of good success with just creating care teams while keeping the core elements of behavioral threat assessment in there, and looking at it more broadly. And also, behavioral threat assessment, it makes people think that there's sort of, we're going to scan their eyeballs like in Minority Report or something like that and see if, so you do get like the
The crazy.
the personal rights and everything else, which is obviously like is definitely important. And I think one of the things with the idea of like surveillance and the surveillance state and how we live in, when you frame things around the idea that you don't know where these attacks are coming from or who's going to be committing them, you again, it brings you into that. Well, then we need that protection of
More
surveillance, right? We
policing,
need
more
to
policing.
we need to see what everybody is doing, when in fact as we have described both in Vermont and in the case studies that I presented, was that we have long histories of these individuals that we actually do know who needs the help the most, and we do know
Just doing it.
who's being the most concerning behaviors. Yeah.
So let me ask you this. How can a parents or something get somebody like you to go into their district, or how to get their school district to call somebody like you to come in? And because like I stated, there's issues, and I'm quite sure that parents see a lot and are capable of seeing a lot, but how do we get that? Like, is there a way that we could get that into motion?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, I'll give myself a shameless plug. Go to TVTP Solutions. It's acronym of Targeted Violence Terrorism Prevention Solutions. There's a contact page there, and send me an email, and I'll be happy to talk to you. I don't take on individual cases, so I'm not a caseworker. So if you have sort of like a neighbor or somebody that that you're worried about, don't come to me. Okay, I'm not.
Not that
That's
kind of
not.
person.
I'm not in that field, and I don't have that medical sort of technical expertise. But in being able to set up the infrastructure of your school or your municipality, we've seen
Yes.
sort of behavioral threat assessment care teams go, cities and towns instituting them sort of city and town wide, instead of just where a lot of them are placed in schools,
Mhm.
which we recommend against. Schools have enough problems just internally where they don't need to be the nucleus of threat assessment for the entire town. That's something that they should be a component of the behavioral threat assessment team, not the nucleus of the main coordinating body for it. So if you want to me to speak about how you set up that infrastructure and what types of things, based on the landscape of the environment, whether it's a school or a place of business or a town municipality, by all means, get in touch with me, and we'll work through sort of what your needs are. Sometimes it's just as easy as doing a presentation and just getting people sort of on the bus, right? Like
Mhm.
sometimes people just need to know that there is another way,
Hmm.
and that they just need that reframing, and they go and they take it. And then there are others that like, okay, yeah, we're already on board with this. Now we want to move to steps 2, 3, and 4, right? And so we have sort of levels of expertise, that we can go based upon the needs, and whether you're in the law enforcement sector, or whether you're in the education sector, mental health, or just general public. And I think some of the best things that we've done actually are more in the general public. So reaching out to those sort of atypical partners, the library system, departments of rec. We had a great success with FedEx and UPS. We did a presentation with FedEx and realized that they didn't have, at the time, they didn't have a really defined process of their drivers reporting suspicious activity. So they had like a security department that dealt with issues If like you screamed or got into a physical confrontation with a FedEx driver, there was a process by which they would do it. But they didn't have a defined process for drivers to relay, hey, I'm on this route every single day for the last 6 years, and this one house keeps like has an exorbitant amount of like hazardous material stuff being me bringing it to it within a short time frame. And like there's other things with the house that's sort of like weird, like somebody should go and check that out. They didn't have sort of a process for that. We've worked with sanitation departments for the same sort of reasons. We branched out for that. I did mention sort of bus drivers and incorporating those, small business associations, houses of worship, like the whole gambit, and really, really looking at sort of that holistic community approach, because people see people in different settings, right?
Yes.
Exactly.
And so what may be a behavioral problem within the school isn't a behavioral problem at Department of Rec, or isn't a
Mhm.
behavioral problem in a different sort of setting. And so when you get the clear, more rounded sort of character arc or character narrative of what's going on with that individual's life, the better you are at assessing sort of what the needs are, or maybe there needs to be a change here. And we have seen individuals who are in one setting, whether it's a school setting. There was a kid that I got, was told about, where he was really big into science or something like that, and he was in some sort of biology class, but he was in the class that he was in was not, the other students were not taking it as seriously as he was, and he was really gung-ho about wanting to be a scientist or graduating from scientist, and he was getting more and more frustrated with the kids in the class, and he ends up making a threat to both the teacher and the class that he's going to come in and going to kill everybody in this class. And they did a behavioral threat assessment and realized that he wasn't, like, what his motivations were for why he said that. They just changed his schedule around to sort of like move him to sort of honors science, change the environment, no more behavioral problems, right? And so it sometimes it's just an easy fix like that. I had a woman who ran a pottery shop up in northern New Hampshire. Again, there was an individual around town who was sort of ranting and raving and causing a lot of problems. And she just invited him to one of her free pottery teaching classes at night that she did. He took to it. She then gave him a job at the pottery store, gave him that sense of identity, that purpose. Somebody cared about him. Boom.
Isn't it
No more
amazing how
issue, right?
one
Yeah.
little act can make such a huge difference in somebody's life? So it's not only just I mean, it's kind of like, to me, the way I take it, it's kind of upon us as individuals as well to try to educate ourselves or keep our eyes open and just say, hey, look, and notice. We
Yeah.
try to notice things,
Yeah.
just as individuals.
And I think that's really a good core message of I'm not here trying to make intervention specialists out of people. I am trying to sort of give the knowledge base, or frame what I see are sort of the gaps, right? And empower people to realize that it doesn't take a clinician to really intercede on that individual's behalf. Like it's great to have all this stuff, but if we're crossing over that threshold where this stuff needs to be employed, our prevention efforts have kind of failed in a big way,
Yeah, we're late.
right? And so things like the Power of Hello, that campaign where you just sort of, how you doing, how it makes a huge difference. Little things that teachers do, people around town do, just little niceties. It's amazing the compounding of what that will do. People don't think of that as prevention, and that's fine.
It absolutely
But
is.
it
Because there's
absolutely is, right? Yeah.
yeah,
And so getting people to understand how, like, the vast sort of world of what prevention can be. And I think one of the reasons why we sort of devalue it to a certain extent is because it's not always quantitative, right? And
Mm.
there is something when you see the bars on the windows and the cops with the guns and something like that, there is a theoretical value that comes with that. And people sort of believe, well, if we're going to spend $1 million on security, we're going to get a return of $1 million, right? Or more. And because prevention has such, it's so easy to do, and there's such a less sort of monetary thing that puts to it, the theoretical value gets sort of out of whack. And, in the same way that a Michelin star restaurant is rated on three things: ambiance, service, and food, right? And they're all dependent on one another. In fact, there's been studies that have shown that, human beings cannot differentiate between the person that cooks the food and the boy that sweeps the floor, right? In that if the whole experience doesn't lend itself, putting Michelin star food is not going to change anything, right? So if you go to a restaurant and it's the food is fantastic, but it's next to a fertilizer plant, right, and everything smells like urine and cow crap, you're not going to be able to differentiate Michelin star food from everything else. And so the same out of weight sort of thing I see with security, of that there is such an overweight of value to protection and preparedness, much like sort of like, well, we've got the best food or we've got the best cooks, right? But we haven't really shaped the environment of that service and that ambiance of the restaurant necessarily. And so it's more just an evening out of it, which actually makes everything better, right? And so the whole experience better. So if you're trying to do, holistic security, that is kind of what you want. You want to have a real healthy and robust prevention methodology, as well as, and you'll be far more targeted with your protection and your preparedness response measures, because you'll know if somebody crosses over the threshold of your preparedness measures, these are the types of things that you're sort of going to need. And so that is kind of, the long and short of it really is just kind of getting people on board with this, understanding that, and most people like it. Most people who might be in a certain sector don't necessarily see it for their job title, but you can sort of see it with, I often kind of take this stuff. We can solve this problem with our business card, or we can solve this problem with our name tag, right? And the more we try to solve this problem with our name tag rather than sort of our business card and what our role is, I think the better off we will be.
I had it and then it's gone. Damn
I was
it.
just saying you were about to say something.
Well, I really like it. The way my mind is interpreting it, because my mind is like, let me simplify this for you, Giselle, because but it's like, if we go back, it's not just children, or it's all ages that we're
Right.
it's yeah, we look at all ages, but in my mind it also helps recognize that, because these children, when they're going through something at a young age, such as sleeping in their vehicle, or you know, abusive home, or anything of that
Abuse.
sort, um, they already have other mixtures of feelings that they're learning. And so those little things that are happening to them, or big things, it leans them towards something, and helping them, if finding that source early on when they're in that age and going through it, it helps them to not fester in it and then become something, that we totally could have prevented. And even
Absolutely. Yeah.
and with adults, it's the same thing. What may be a breakup may not be big to me, but that can be big to come somebody else. Losing, the smallest of things, a financial situation can cause somebody to just break.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
We got to stop looking at it to where, well, it's a small situation. It's small to me, but it's not small to them. And that's where society,
Lack
that
of
it's a society
empathy.
thing. Yeah, you go back to the lack of empathy. We lost humans in society has lost empathy in that area because we're so stuck in our own worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that you came
Mm-hmm.
on here and just kind of was like, look, we actually open up here and open up your minds. We could be preventing in a different way.
Yeah, and I don't think that's. I think we've gotten to this sort of stage. It again, it's how we frame it, right? And
Mhm.
we naturally, our behaviors, as I mentioned, are focused in on feelings. We have to have a feeling first. We do the behavior, and then we sort of post rationalize after
Hmm.
we do it, and we instill logic into our behavior after the fact, not process logic
Tired.
that makes us feel something, right? And so I think it's just we have it is a very natural shift to go in this more direction because it's much more appealing to us. We are just sort of operating within a framework where it's not always as presented as clear to us like this. And so it's if I can if this conversation does anything, it's hopefully to sort of just change slightly that framing, which is why I usually lead with sort of that there's no violence that's random, and hope that people sort of respond to that sort of framing and understanding.
Yeah, I absolutely love the way you did the frame, the way you're talking about it and all of that. It does make a big difference. And I can really see that. I appreciate you coming on here, Robert. This has been an amazing conversation and very, very insightful for sure. Like, Giselle, did you have anything else you needed to add?
No, I don't. I think I got what I needed to say out. I held on to that for quite a minute because I did not want to interrupt because it was going so well.
Yeah,
Well, I'll just
yeah.
make a final plug. Like, ladies, it's been an absolute pleasure. And if you want to have me back, to talk about anything, I'm happy to come on back. This is great fun. And for anybody that's listening or watching, TVTP Solutions, and there's a contact page. This interview will be up there on our media page as well as a couple of educational videos. So if you want to deep dive a little bit more or you need something to showcase what we kind of talked about here to whomever, to get them on board to hire or to have me talk or whatever it is, by all means, check those out. And I can't thank you ladies enough. It's been a great time.
Absolutely has. For those of you that want to get in contact with us to share your story, you and want to remain anonymous, we respect that, but your story can and will help others in theirs. You can contact us at 12 look in through THRU 34 the glass at gmail.com. You can contact us through our Facebook and our TikTok. We are currently working on more platforms. We will get back to you when those come up. Thank you once again for looking into the glass.